this final session, final plenary session of the Latin American meeting of the World Economic Forum. I hope you share with me the feeling that this has been an incredibly successful meeting, and we're all in awe and gratitude to Klaus Schwab for leading this effort of organizing such a successful meeting. I wanted to say that he's a very lucky man, but then I was reminded of this line by, I think it is Gary Player, who says, the more I practice, the luckier I get. So in any case, we will start by introducing first Hilde Schwab, who's the chair of the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurs, and she's going to come and present to us the Social Entrepreneurship Award for Latin America.
President Calderon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. The World Economic Forum's and my husband's motto since over 30 years has been entrepreneurship in the global public interest. This means that business at the end has to serve society at large. And as we witnessed this week, the commitment to social responsibility was felt again and again at this meeting. During the last decade, we encountered many individuals whose main or sole motivation is to create social innovation and to work at the grassroots level to improve the fate of millions of people who otherwise would be left out. To promote these people, Klaus Schwab and I have created the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship, which in cooperation with media and other partners selects the Social Entrepreneur of the Year in over 20 countries. In the past months, new entrepreneurs have been awarded in Latin America. We have the great pleasure to welcome the winners of the Social Entrepreneur of the Year award from Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil. And I would like to come up to the stage with me. So here. From Colombia, Alvaro Davila, Fundación Social. Behind this foundation are 12 highly successful enterprises focused on banking, insurance, and housing for the poor. Fundación Social has more than 5 million low-income clients and 320 offices all over Colombia. From Argentina, Gustavo Genuso, Fundación Gente Nueva. Gustavo was studying nuclear engineering when he came across a much more challenging problem, transforming the education system for the young rural poor. He set up schools that are fully managed by the communities and provide schooling and job skill training. From Brazil, Sebastião Rocha, Centro Popular de Cultura e Desenvolvimento. As a teacher, Sebastião asked himself whether school could not be a more delightful place. As a result, he created a full database of exotic learning approaches, including games, mobile libraries, theater, and music. Over 20,000 young people have gone through his programs in more than 6 Brazilian states, Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau. We would like to congratulate all three for their outstanding contribution to society. Thank you. And now we come to the announcement of the winner of the Social Entrepreneur of the Year 2008 in Mexico. And I would like to join me on stage the 3 finalists in Mexico. Margarita Barne, Group to Promote Education and Sustainable Development. The group disseminates technologies that help address the lack of water, food insecurity, rural migration, and inadequate housing. Through microloans and the sale of handicrafts made from solid wastes and processed food, the organization helps families to improve their income. Alicia Leal Puerta, Pacific Alternatives. Alicia has relentlessly fought to bring the subject of violence against women out of the secrecy of their homes into the public limelight. She offers pragmatic support to affected women in the form of medical treatment, shelter, and legal aid. The organization campaigns at the local, regional, and national level to sensitize the public on the topic of domestic violence, its root causes and consequences, and alternative solutions. Cecilio Solis Librado, Network for Native Tourism, RITA. To improve the highly impoverished situation of the Indios, Cecilio Solis founded RITA in 2002 as an indigenous tourism company with fellow Indios from 17 different nations and 15 states in Mexico. RITA focuses on designing tour packages, creating the right infrastructure and hotels for tourists to experience the traditional indigenous culture and natural environment. Last week, the Mexican jury has chosen this year's winner, and it is Margarita Barne, founder of Group to Promote Education and Sustainable Development.
Muchas gracias. Pasemos ahora a la próxima etapa de esta sesión final.
The next stage of this final session. This is a meeting where 544 people have participated from 44 different countries. But actually, thanks to the new Web Point 2, we have had participating and will participate in the coming days millions of people through YouTube. So now I'd like to show you a video of what is going to be seen on YouTube of the ideas and the comments that were made during this meeting. Please show the video.
Hola YouTube. Lo que necesitamos en América Latina para tener un nivel mundial es competir.
El camino del desarrollo económico.
De la formación de sus recursos humanos.
Sensibilización.
Culturizar a los jóvenes.
Integrar nuestro comercio.
Competitividad. Educación.
Hacia la inversión y hacia los negocios.
Sustentabilidad de los países en vías de desarrollo.
Inversión en infraestructura.
Con información.
La otra es inversión.
Ideas. Es la educación.
Exportar talento.
Combatir la desigualdad.
Es lo que es la integración entre las comunidades y las ciudades. Un crecimiento económico sostenido.
Promoción. La inversión en la infraestructura.
Generando confianza.
Viabilidad. Inversión social.
Unirnos y reunirnos.
Evitar la fuga de cerebros.
Libertad.
La distribución.
Extracción de petróleo.
Establecer los procesos de invasión.
Political integration.
Un sitio ideal para la inversión.
Vería actividades educativas y lúdicas para los niños de las escuelas.
Biocombustibles.
Términos de transferencia de tecnología.
Es la inserción de Latinoamérica en el mundo de las tecnologías.
En primer lugar es la educación. En segundo lugar, la educación. Y en tercer lugar, la educación.
Okay. Bueno, este es un primer ejemplo de
Well,
cómo
this is
integrar
an
a la
initial
gente.
example of how we can integrate people through technology. A second example of how we can integrate people through technology is going to be done now with this audience. You have been giving a little electronic device that allows you to vote. And when you came in, you were given a questionnaire having to do with the following. Which should be the priorities over the next 20 months so that the decade of 2010 be a promising decade for Latin America? And you were given 10 choices. I would request that the options be shown on the screen. But they are, first, economic growth, and to dealing with the international recession. Second, economic security, how to promote access to housing, to water, to banking and employment. 3, education, how to construct a value system and education system. 4th, energy security, how to meet the growing demand for energy. 5, infrastructure and investments, how to create the flow of investments that we so urgently need. 6, natural resources. How can we make a responsible use of water and other natural resources? Renewable energies, security, technology and environmental change, and urban development. Those are the 10 options that you have. If you would please use your devices. I'm going to ask Pierre. Pierre.
Please, could you please take your spot, me? You press the blue button, then you select down to voting, and you press the green button for OK, and now you're ready to vote.
Okay. Entonces creo que deben tener ahí la.
So I think you have the list. 1, economic growth. 2, economic security. 3, education. 4, energy security. 5, infrastructure. 6, natural resources. 7, renewable energies. 8, security. 9, technology and climate change. And 10, urban development. So I'm going to give you a few more seconds, figuring that the average age of this public is not 20 years of age. And there we see the result. Education, 46%. Then comes economic growth and economic security. Infrastructure, 12%. Security, 11%. This is interesting. Education, infrastructure, security, and only after that, economic growth and economic security. Well, this has been an introduction which allows me to move on to introduce our panel of presidents. I'd like to first introduce President Oscar Arias of Costa Rica. I believe that Al Gore is the only politician that I know that has won the Nobel Prize and an Oscar, but he didn't win the presidency. President Arias has won the presidency twice. He's earned a Nobel Prize, and he's called Oscar. President Arias, in the international context that we have ahead of us, where there's a looming international recession, possibly led by the United States, where there are populist pressures both in the United States and throughout the rest of the hemisphere against free trade, and where this translates into a domestic context, an internal context which is difficult. What do you believe are the major challenges for Latin America as a whole, and what are the international political challenges that the region will be facing over the next few months?
Well, the main challenge for Latin America, now that we have left behind the long and dark night of military dictatorships, is to show that we can meet the most urgent need of our people within a pluralist democracy with respect for human rights and freedom. We all know that democracy is not an end in itself. It's a way, it's a means that is very important, because what's important in a political system is the human being. And if that human being doesn't see his or her living conditions to improve, then he will be questioning the political system under which he lives. And since we've had democratic regimes that did not meet those needs, the most urgent ones such as health, education, housing, honesty, transparency, infrastructure, a true split of power in Latin America as they have in Europe and in the United States, where the various branches of government work, not like in our countries where the executive moves like a pendulum from too much authoritarianism to great weakness. The legislature in many countries has confused immunity and impunity. The court system is not always a separate and autonomous branch. It is in my country because the executive branch provides it with a budget and nobody can then touch that budget or play with the independence and the autonomy of our courts, magistrates, and judges. But these failings are what has brought up populism and demagogy in certain regimes in Latin America in recent years. You have governments in Latin America that have turned ideology into demagogy and demagogy into ideology. Our democracies are weak, and if they're not consolidated, and let's recall the words of Immanuel Kant, that the need to consolidate democracy, as Kant said when he talked about morality, if you don't make progress, you're really falling behind. And that's the big challenge, to have the growth rates we've had in the past. For instance, in Costa Rica, we grew at the rate of 8-9% a couple of years ago. Last year at a rate of 6 to 8%. And the same has happened in Latin America, but that growth rate is going to slow down because of the U.S. recession. And the need for the political leaders to understand that to govern is to educate is important. And that's not the only heading that applies only to Latin America. It applies to the entire world, and the U.S. is certainly not an exception. It's really a rule that applies to all. Today you can see opposition to free trade just to get votes. They turned down a free trade agreement with Colombia to get more votes. They want to revise NAFTA to get votes. So if there's a country in the world where the politician tells people what they want to know rather than what they should know, is what we see in the United States, and that's a denial of leadership. I agree with those who voted for education as the number one issue. If we don't educate people, it's going to be very difficult to have a more prosperous Latin America in the next few years. And that explains not only our poverty and our inequality, but that inequality is what explains the lack of security and the violence. Out of every 10 young people, 3 enter high school. Out of every 10 young people, 7 drop out of high school. Out of every 10 teenagers who entered high school, only 1 ends up going to the university. All of those who dropped out end up stealing, kidnapping, or maybe committing suicide. And it's not been the hard, tough policies that have won over people. To overcome violence, to win over that feel of insecurity is to be done in other ways. And the problem has been we've not been able to come up with priorities. I am a Costa Rican, and this year, in 2008, we eliminated the army 60 years ago. If we spend 6% of our budget or of our GDP today on public education, and I hope that that number will go up to 8% of GDP during my administration, we've be able to do that in a large measure because for 60 years we've not spent money on soldiers and weapons.
President Uribe,
President Uribe has also been elected twice as president of his country, and he has been president during a period of very high economic growth, the highest rate of economic growth in the history of Colombia, but this within a very difficult international context, and I would say an increasingly hostile one. We know the problem that he has in getting his free trade agreement approved in the United States. We know the problems he has in domestic insecurity and the international implications that this is having. President Uribe, could you talk to us about your international strategy to be able to continue with the development successes of your country within the context that you have? It is very difficult to address an international strategy in a country that has to deal with some very serious domestic problems, even though there is a very good trend for improvement. Allow me to answer your question specifically, Mr. Hausman. I'd like to tell you that in our administration, we view Colombia as a house where we all need to fit. In the roof, we've placed the word trust. The trust of confidence of living in Colombia, of investing in Colombia. And this house has 3 pillars. The security of democracy, that's very important. Latin America has had many projects for security of dictatorships. Security of democracy means respect of human rights, of transparency, and rights for everyone, regardless of whether these citizens have friends in government or not, regardless of whether there are business leaders, etc. The second pillar is the confidence for investors, and the third is social cohesion, and they are integrated. The problem of security in Colombia, we notice that people are determined to defeat that problem of lack of security generated by a terrorist drug traffic, and people don't invest. We need also a good management of the economy and give people the confidence to invest, and that allows us the possibility of building social cohesion. At the same time, as we move forward with social cohesion, we give legitimacy to the security, to investor confidence. So all of these pillars are closely connected. Each one depends on the other two. Now, On the issue of the confidence for investors, we have a number of points. First, to persist in our policy of democratic security, that the world not doubt that we're committed to it. Second, to provide all the necessary guarantees to the private sector, both domestic and international, for investing in Colombia. That which seems elemental needs to be repeated in Latin America, because there are many tendencies to have the state take over, and this has been a failure in Latin America. Investment with social responsibility. Third, good macroeconomic management. We have dropped our deficit from 7.5 to 3.3. We've the consolidated deficit to 4.2 to 0.7. The drop in indebtedness, we've reduced it from 50% of GDP to 28%. We've reformed 420 state agencies to have a more efficient and transparent state, and the latest one was the Colombian Oil Company, that in a hostile Latin American environment, we have been able to do labor reform, the reform of pensions, and to capitalize us with the contributions of 500,000 Colombian citizens, which raises capitalization 10%. This reform has saved the government 10 points of the GDP. The idea isn't to reduce the tax levels for everyone, but rather to introduce incentives for investment. The new idea of economic free zones or special economic zones. This year, we should end up having 50 in Colombia. Something very important, to give investors the possibility of agreements with the government that they are going to have stable rules of the game for 20 years. And the trade treaties. In the trade treaties, we prepared the Andean treaty with Chile. We've already enhanced our treaty with Peru to go beyond the Andean community, to break the barriers that existed to investment. We've signed a treaty with 3 Central American countries: El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. We are negotiating with Canada, with the European Union. We're negotiating a treaty with China and India, and we have the FTA with the United States. Obstacles to the FTA, I have to be very careful in what I say. The first thing that we harbor as a hope is that the United States preserve a bipartisan policy towards Colombia. Number 2, we are going to continue doing our homework. 3, we have to ask that people don't take a snapshot of Colombia, but rather a video. The snapshot only shows an instant. The video can show a trend, that they look at where we were and where we are, because we have many problems. We've solved many as well. And just as we acknowledge all that needs to be done, we would ask the international community, in this case the U.S. Congress, acknowledge everything that we've done. We have had a rate of assassination of 68%. Still very high, but it's a noticeable reduction. We've gone from 3,000 kidnappings per year to 270 last year. We practically eradicated in the major capitals. We have a country that was barely visited by 500,000 people a year. Last year, 1.2 million. This is a country that in 4 years saw the destruction of 200 municipalities because of terrorism. In the last 36 months, they haven't been able to destroy a single municipality. A country that has demobilized 46,000 members of the terrorist groups, of 60,000 that we encountered, a country that is open to international criticism, to the observers of the NGOs. In my administration, we've authorized the extradition of almost 700 individuals linked to drug trafficking to the United States. And I think that no other country in the world can claim that. In Colombia, we had 15 journalists assassinated per year. Last year, it was 1. And the justice has said, for reasons not linked to his activities, our own journalists are less threatened. We have recovered the idea that only the state can challenge the terrorists And we want all of this to be seen by the United States, by the international community, and the U.S. Congress. In Colombia, 250 trade union leaders were assassinated per year. Last year, they assassinated 26. We are making a major effort because we want zero assassinations. We've doubled the budget for justice. We're overcoming impunity. There are 136 people in jail today because of all those crimes. Mr. Hausman, our strategy is to ask you to look at our video. Don't look at the snapshot. Now, the question of security with our neighbors. For instance, the incident stemming from the fact that under my responsibility, the order was given to bombing in the Ecuadorian jungle where there was terrorist groups of the FARC. Why do I say under my orders? Because we have to make people believe in our public forces. I could have said, no, that was a mistake of our Air Force, and I've called the commander to explain himself, but that would have been irresponsible. We would have lost the confidence in our armed forces. It is the president who gave the order who has to say, I assume total responsibility for that military action. Why? Because the FARC was established there for some time now and committing crimes against Colombians from that base. So what are we going to do? Our decision is to comply with what was agreed in the Rio Group and the OAS. Please do not harbor in your terror any criminals who are assassinating Colombians. That Colombia is committed to live up to its commitment of not repeating that action. Now, one of the things that has forced me morally to to come to Mexico is to look at President Calderón and to face the Mexican journalists for the death of some Mexicans in that camp. And I have to repeat what I've been saying since last night. President Calderón has often said when we met yesterday, he complained for the death of these young men. He submitted his complaints to the Colombian authorities. He's asked my government to collaborate with an investigation to find out all the details, and we've agreed to do so. And it's also odd that I have said that these young men are terrorists. And why have I said that? Well, I deplore their death as I deplore the death of anybody, even the death of Raúl Reyes. But one has to live up with our responsibility of protecting those citizens threatened by terrorists. Why do I call them terrorists? First of all, they were not in that camp complying an authorized humanitarian operation. Then they were there voluntarily. Then the videos shown by the armed forces of Ecuador show them is a very familiar relationship with the FARC, equivalent to belonging to the FARC, to complicity with this terrorist group. Why is the FARC a terrorist group? Because of the facts, because of the funding, and because they harm a democracy. It is different to talk about the Latin American guerrillas that were facing dictatorships and for that reason had legitimacy. In Colombia, they're disturbing a democracy. In the rest of Latin America, they weren't funded through drugs. In Colombia, they are. They also assassinate women, children. There are 1,700 people of the armed forces mutilated because of mines. Raúl Reyes, that these young men were with, belongs to the groups that kidnaps Ingrid Betancourt. That group in the last 10 years has kidnapped many people and hasn't returned 750 of the hostages. We have made every possible effort. Furthermore, a respectable democracy like ours is entitled to proceed as other democracies proceed, such as in Europe, where they say, since here we have democratic liberties, we have to indicate as terrorism violence or the threat of using violence. Our strategy is to ask the world to look at our video, to face the world. We respect Mexico, its government, its people. We want to work with in the greatest possible harmony with the government of President Calderón. And we want to discuss these issues very openly in Mexico, in the United States, in Europe, in South America, with our neighbors. What do we ask our neighbors on the other side of the border? Please do not harbor terrorists. Today for me, tomorrow for you. We have not been bellicose with our neighbors. We never will be. But Colombia 5 years ago decided to get rid of this nightmare of 40 years of terrorism, and we have to do it. Thank you.
President
Calderón. President Calderón was elected by Mexicans to the presidency, and that's a great honor. But it's even a greater honor for me that President Calderón is a graduate of the Kennedy School at Harvard. We mentioned that in all of our publicity materials, and we'll take whatever credit we deserve. Mr. President, Mexico's economic growth has been hard to speed up. And now Mexico is facing a complex international context. Mexico has got the most integrated economy with that of the United States and U.S. entering recession. Mexico has an FTA with the United States, which presidential candidates now want to revise. Mexico had, as President Arias said, a problem of a fragile democracy when it comes to the rules of the game, the discussions that reflects an environment that President Arias referred to when he talked about other countries of the region. You're a man of action and a decisive man. What is your strategy to broach those challenges? Thank you, Ricardo. Well, those are many topics wrapped up in one. Let me start with the economic issues. During 15 years, 14 years, it was a great strategic advantage for Mexico at the time under NAFTA, the free trade agreement, which allowed Mexico to enjoy quick growth, foreign investments, generation of jobs linked to the export sector, growth of the salary mass. But now this total correlation with the U.S. economy, from being a great advantage, now becomes a great disadvantage. Manufacturing, industrial production, for instance, between the U.S. and Mexico shows such a correlation that you cannot distinguish or differentiate differences in the way both economies behave. So this reflects that old saying that when the United States got a cold, Mexico would catch pneumonia. The problem I have as president is that what do we do when the United States doesn't get a cold but gets pneumonia? What will we get? And the strategy that we're implementing includes a number of elements. Let me talk about the short term. What are we doing in the short term? What I tell Mexicans is that if we're paying for the main driver on which our economy depends, we've got to also start our own drivers. Which are our drivers? Investment in infrastructure, number one. Investments in infrastructure in and of itself supports aggregate demand, generates economic growth, and creates economic growth that is of better quality. You can look at whatever studies you want to, but if you analyze here in Mexico how or what has been the contribution to employment by every point to GDP. It's roughly 240,000 jobs for every point of GDP, and that has strongly supported economic growth. Last year, 2007, between that year and this year, we increased not only the public investment budget in infrastructure, but we multiplied private investment mechanisms. For instance, we created the National Infrastructure Fund, which makes it possible to place profitable assets in the hands of the government. We can have toll roads that are placed with the investors, and that makes it possible for us to finance new infrastructure projects. With all these mechanisms, Mexico has gone from investing 3% of GDP in infrastructure to investing this year and during the next 5 years 5.5% of GDP in the infrastructure. So that's my first answer. If the Congress approves a reform on hydrocarbons that I suggested to Congress, the additional investment we could have in that sector could trigger at least one additional point of GDP, or maybe even 1.5 increase per year. So Mexico could have investment rates in infrastructure of 7% of GDP, which would really impel its growth tremendously. Number two, we are making public expenditures in a much more pointed way. We have overcome administrative mistakes that have delayed public expenditures, and without spending more, but rather spending more wisely and in a more timely way, public expenditures are also contributing to support the economy. The first quarter, public expenditures were over 100% relative to the first quarter of last year. Thirdly, we started a program to support the economy given present circumstances. That means greater investments of the state in Mexican oil. Even with the prices for oil that we have, I ordered a reduction by 50% of the tariff for electric service during peak hours to reduce costs for electric power companies, and a stimulus of fiscal arrangements in the marginal and highly marginal neighborhoods and parts of Mexico, over a third of the country. Cancun obviously is not a highly marginalized community. It's much wealthier, but 80 miles from here you've got highly marginalized poor municipalities where we have fiscal stimuli that are such so that every company investing there will get a 100% tax break when it comes to corporate rates and the government will pay for a year and a half 100% of Social Security payments. In other words, all Social Security payments, the cost of that, the Infonavit, the housing expenditures will be supported by us. We have a package to pay for transportation of workers, kindergartens, and child care centers for working mothers in those areas, etc. And thirdly, we will continue with a number of reforms, which is really the only way that will make it possible for our economy to grow. I was telling Mexicans that in order to compete in the great world economic race, we've got to change the motor in our car. That means making significant changes in the engine that will make the engine run faster, compete faster. For the last year, as I said last night, we have made a change in the treasury system that improves public revenue collection. It makes it possible to increase expenditures in infrastructure, to increase expenditures in health and education. I explained that Mexico is spending $100 billion a year in social programs. We have a similar figure to that of Costa Rica. We devote 6% of GDP to education. That's in the public sector, and then the private sector devotes about 1.52%. And even so, our problem is not the expenditures, but quality. But quality is yet another topic. We've also carried out the fiscal reform, which gave us 2% of GDP every year, a reform of the pension system, which made it possible for us to change from the pay-as-you-go system to an individual accounts system for public civil servants. This has made it possible to avoid having public finances go bankrupt. And just for you to have an idea, public finances on the basis of net present value have had savings of 26% of GDP as a result of these reforms. We've also modified the justice system in order to have an adversarial system that's cleaner, more transparent, and it's also fairer. It was debatable, but we had changed the electoral system that established rules of the game and arbiters or referees of electoral matters, and now we're working on energy reforms. All of these reforms and many others that are still missing in the field of telecommunications, labor relations, will make it possible for Mexico to have a much more competitive economy. At the end of the day, stagnation, recession in the United States, no matter what will happen there, and we hope that this only stagnation will have a certain specific duration, 6 months, 10 months, 12 months. Mexicans will have to speed up our own growth rate. We'll have to go for strengthening the international market, strengthen stability, socioeconomic and political stability. Mexico suffers from what Latin American countries have. There's a threat, there is a risk against its institutions, but from what I've seen in Mexico, I don't believe that our democratic institutions are fragile. Quite to the contrary, given the threats, given the attacks and the danger of those who have attacked us, I believe that the democratic Mexican institutions have been very resilient, very sound. Otherwise, probably we wouldn't be here if that were not the case. And finally, I would like to tell my good friend President Uribe, with whom we've talked about many things, the following. I know that Colombia and Mexico share many principles that are key for the future of Latin America. The principle of certainty to companies and to individuals. The key in Latin America, and this is maybe another topic, is to provide certainty. We're working on that. Then the principles of freedom, security, and entitlements or rights. As President of Mexico, it's my job to defend the interests of Mexicans, and I do so gladly, and to respond to offenses, events that have led parents to lose their children, which we regret, events that happened on May 1st. President Uribe, I've accepted your explanations in that there was no knowledge that there were Mexicans there. This was a remote camp far from any town, but we've also agreed to carry out an investigation that will lead us to straighter, more direct conclusions. The advantage is that we would have an investigation, we'll cooperate with Colombia on that, and then the prudent thing is not to prejudge, not to describe in one way or other the characteristics or the activities of these young people. Rather, when the results of the investigation are made public, then everybody can draw their conclusions. I agree with the idea that the events carried out by FARC are terrorist events. We cannot fail to call a terrorist if a person places a bomb, kidnaps people, or kills his victims. So I agree with that completely. But I don't want to get ahead and draw conclusions as to the identity of these young people. We each have our own assumptions, but I believe that the parents, the pain of the parents, the memory of their children deserve the benefit of the doubt until these investigations are completed. Mexico will continue cooperating with Colombia and with all countries that support freedom and law enforcement to ensure safe living conditions to our people first and to all people who wish to invest in our countries.
I think that we'll now have open up the floor for some questions from the public. So I offer the floor. If there are any questions, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. In the meantime, while people give this some thought, I'd like to ask a question of President Arias. President Arias, if you were to define 3 strategic areas where you believe that both Costa Rica and Latin America should concentrate on, what will those 3 areas be? In our case, but I believe that this is applicable to most of Latin America, as has been said here, there's the question of infrastructure. As I already said, infrastructure, not only roads and harbors and airports. We don't have the Latin American resources to have the state to do it. So we have to grant concessions for these public works. And in that, Costa Rica has a few advantages. We're a democratic country with the most stable democracy of Latin America. It is a country that, together with Uruguay, is one that has held democratic values most firmly in Latin America. We have a country that has the rule of law, which has a judicial branch which gives assurances to the investor who is going to be able to take his assets back. And that's what we're doing. We are building that infrastructure which is going to allow us to achieve a better ranking on your competitiveness list, Mr. Schwab. The second is education. Education is essential, and I'm so pleased to share that opinion with all of you, because the quality of education and the amount of education does not allow us to go from the feudalism in which some Latin Americans live, while others live in a period of postmodernism. We need more egalitarian societies and more prosperous societies. Thomas Friedman says that there are 12,000 universities in the world, of which 4,000 are in the United States. 1/3. The remaining 2/3 are in the rest of the world. The Times of London says that amongst the 200 best universities in the world, only 3 are in Latin America, and amongst the 100 best university, none is in Latin America. Now, how are we going to finance this education? And the third priority, I would say, is to spend more on science and technology. Decrease the digital gap, to make an effort for all societies to have better access to broadband internet, and to share with you something that you all know, that of the growth of the world output over the last 25 years, 88% is due to new technologies, and only 12% is due to the expansion of existing production systems. So that is an incredible challenge if we want to have this leap in development. How are we going to finance this? You are probably considering a number of options. Costa Rican like myself would like to mention only 2. One, which is not politically correct in a forum of businessmen, but I have to say it quite honestly, that in Latin America we don't pay taxes, that the rich don't pay enough taxes, that in Latin America, after having paid taxes and having made the ratios, the Gini ratio drops 2 points, while the European Union, after having paid the taxes and having made the necessary transfers, the Gini ratio drops 14 points. And in Ireland, it drops 19 points. So that shows that our tax system is not progressive. And to be honest and to be fair, the exception is Brazil, where they have an average tax rate similar to that of Europe. And the other issue as to how we can finance this finance our spending in education, science, and technology and infrastructure, and that is by cutting back military spending in Latin America. That with the exception of Colombia, there's absolutely no reason for us at the beginning of the 21st century to have an arms race, particularly in the Southern Cone. That Latin America spent today $36 billion in military spending is a monstrosity. We don't need to do that, because with each F-16 that we don't buy, we can build many clinics, many universities, many schools, and many roads, and give potable water to thousands of Latin America who don't have access to clean water. With every Black Hawk that we forego buying, we can give scholarships of $100 a month to 4,000 or 5,000 young people in Latin America. This is an issue that I am going to address later if I have time, because just as 20 years ago, I have wanted Costa Rica to be a moral power. 20 years I had to fight with Ronald Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev because they didn't want a Pacific resolution to the conflicts in the region. Today, my country, my administration has introduced a treaty on the arms trade that has already been adopted by the UN. I know, as Victor Hugo would say, that this is not an idea whose time has come, but that the world spends $1.3 trillion in arms and soldiers is immoral. And it is the most perverse investment that one could think of. And in Latin America, where we don't have any true conflicts, the only exception to increased military spending is in Colombia. Together with that, I have introduced another international initiative, and I would ask you to consider it, to see if the businessmen and the political leaders, but you are leaders in the entrepreneurial and academic work, which is called the Consensus of Costa Rica. And the only thing that it aspires to is that we not punish the middle-income countries, particularly high middle income, because they've been successful, because they have a per capita income of $5,500, because they don't forgive our debt or allow us to swap debt for education or swap for debt for nature, because we're almost wealthy. They don't give us subsidized loans because we're doing too well. We've been successful. The United States doesn't consider us for the Millennium Challenge Corporation because Costa Rica is doing too well. And the price has been that we have had to spend in education and health precisely because we haven't had an army for 60 years. And what the Costa Rica consensus says is that we should reward those countries who spend more in education, health, and protection of the environment and less on weapons and soldiers. Very briefly, Ricardo, my third universal initiative is one that was mentioned amongst the priorities and which here amongst these priorities, and it's what we have called peace with nature. Costa Rica is a country that has 4.5% of the world's biodiversity. And one of the most important national parks called Corcovado, we have 2.5% of the world's biodiversity. The 2 million tourists that visit our country, which is half the population. I was saying yesterday to President Calderon that we have 25 million tourists, which is 1/4 of the population of Mexico. They visit us because of our love for conserving our nature, our flora and our fauna. And peace with nature and I don't want to elaborate too long, just to give you the gist of it, is that our goal to fight against climate change, to make Costa Rica increasingly in a country that is covered by trees. Today, over 50% of our country is covered by trees. Last year, we planted 5 million trees, and this year we're going to plant 7 million trees, which makes us the country that more trees plants in per capita terms and per square kilometer. At the international level for the year 2021, when we will have achieved 200 years of independence, be one of the first countries, one of the first neutral countries in neutral carbon emissions. In keeping with such visionary countries and so courageous as countries as New Zealand, Norway, and a few other countries in the Scandinavian world that have joined this initiative to see if we can be carbon neutral as soon as possible. I've established as an example, in order to have the moral authority with my people, that there should be no member of my administration that if they travel has to repay that trip by paying an institution for how many CO2 emissions were emitted by their flight to London or Washington or Miami or wherever. And from their own salary, they have to pay this institution for the harm they have done to our environment.
Well, let me now invite the public to ask questions. There's a request for the floor way back there. Would you identify yourself, please? Good afternoon. I'm Eduardo Arroyo. I represent Puerto Rico 2000. During the last 2 days, we've been hearing a lot about the advantages of greater integration in Latin America. And my question is, what do the members of the panel think about such integration, and what can we do to achieve it? President Uribe? There are many, many integration projects. The important thing is to implement them. As I see it, one problem is that when there is a specific political interest, then it slows down or speeds up an integration project. Somebody might say, for political reasons, I like this one and I support this one, I don't like that one and I don't support that one. And I believe that in order to speed up integration, you need to have respect for diversity. To expect integration with total homogeneity is impossible. So that's one point. The other point is to remove the high level of ideology that we see, for instance, in the case of security. This morning a Mexican journalist asked me, well, these security issues in Colombia and what's happened with the terrorist FARC group, which is the main provider of drugs to the world. One of the good things that we support President Calderon for is the struggle of Mexico against drug trafficking. Mexico cannot forget that that group is the largest drug trafficking group here. The journalist said if you look at FARC from the right, it looks like a terrorist group. If you look at them from the left, they look like a bunch of idealistic young people. Well, it seems to me that the concept of right and left that polarizes people so much is becoming obsolete. It made sense when there were dictatorships and when European theories were imported. And today, when everybody wants to be democratic, I think we need to overcome that definition, and we need to replace it with 5 democratic parameters, which I'd like to propose to you for your thinking. Number 1, democratic security, respect for freedom, fight for social cohesion, transparency, and respect for independent organizations that are part of each state, to guarantee a balance of power which guarantees the rights of citizens. If we manage to overcome ideology, then the split where people say you've got people on the left and people on the right who are old-fashioned, that goes away. Those who represent and speak like the left today often behave like people from the old right and vice versa. Those who believe in democracies have greater differences among them during campaigns that when they take over the government. Those antagonisms, those differences are obsolete. We need to overcome them. We've got to increase freedom to move integration forward, look at them with greater pragmatism and less ideological blinders. And I would tell the Mexican journalists this morning that you cannot look at security from a right or a left point of view. It's a democratic value. Everybody needs security. In the historic process, first the right asked for it, and the left suffered a great deal, because since it was not universal, the left felt it did not have security. Then it realized that they needed security to become a political alternative. Security is a democratic value, it's a universal value. Because of what Colombia has been through, I ask Latin America to understand this. Professor, at the end, I'd like to talk about some priorities of Colombia very briefly. In other words, to answer the question that was just asked. Well, let me give you the floor after President Calderón speaks.
Well, the truth is that we are many Latin Americas, and we all dream and want a Latin American integration. I personally want it. I imagine that one day Latin America could be a region, a continent that is truly brotherly and without any complexes. Our continent reminds me the parable of the talents. If we were to measure the natural, human, and cultural resources that we have everything to be the best region, the most competitive, the strongest, the most vigorous. Even now, even this moment of a crisis of food prices, we have opportunities. But having all of these talents, we tend to bury them, and we spend our life complaining or lamenting our bad luck, and we don't progress. And that happens with integration. We have everything to be integrated. We have a commonality of history, of languages, of credos, of climates, of experiences, of music. After all, everybody likes Mexican music, right? And the vallenato from Colombia. And the truth is, what are the hurdles to integration? One, what President Uribe said. First, we don't know how to respect each other. There's a large doses of dogmatism. And I would say that dogmatism is the major obstacle to Latin American integration, that somebody judge from their ideological and dogmatic standpoint that the others are the bad guys, that somebody imposes or tries to impose in a discussion their own criterion on the others from an ideological perspective. This Manichaeism of dividing people, the good guys are those who think like I think, and everybody else is wrong. And that has kept us from sitting down sensibly around a table. Particularly in recent years, this dogmatism has led to the idea of dividing Latin American countries among those who are good and those who are bad. That's a major hurdle. The lack of respect is also our intervention in the domestic policies of other countries. The financing of organizations, even though they have a social facade or a philanthropic facade, that ends up being a political integration. And that is an obstacle. That is one way of suffering those consequences. President Uribe has denounced, and I believe that all to a greater or lesser extent have had experiences like that. What can we do to integrate? Well, first of all, to deliberately assume not only the will but a process. Mexico has been chairing the Rio Group since last month, and by the way, it's one of the few organizations that brings together Latin American countries, but not all. But there isn't really a Latin American organization. The Rio Group brings together some Latin American countries, but not all. The Caribbean countries aren't represented. And in the end, its purpose has been changing over time and almost vanished. What do we want to do? We want to deliver the chairmanship of the Group of Rio, not as a Group of Rio, but in a few years when we're going to have Mexico's 200th anniversary, that we have a true organization of Latin American states that has a strong component of political cohesion and, if possible, economic cohesion. Second, we also have to make headway in our own economic integration. Today, the distances that for decades were the argument to avoid greater economic interaction amongst Latin American countries, technology and world trade have left behind, and the time has come for Latin America to integrate. The problem is that sometimes we're so fearful, and I'm talking about all our countries, that our productive apparatus is so afraid of competition that even amongst ourselves we are able to open up to trade and to investment. And I think it is critical for Latin America to move forward in schemes of integrated trade, and we should begin with our own people. And I think that we can really transform these potentials into realities. In the final analysis, the key, and I think that one of the results of this World Economic Forum, is that those of us who want to see a prosperous Latin America should be able to put in the sight of investors our beloved Latin America, that an investor not look as a Latin American continent as an aggregate block and he turned the page because there's nothing to do there and nowhere to invest. That you don't consider that Latin America is an area that is condemned to constantly argue with its ideological debates, but doesn't do anything practically or does very little that is positive. We have the opportunity to change the face of Latin America, and that could lead us to a much more integrated Latin America, a much stronger Latin America that not only we want it, but I see it as a tool of prosperity for our people.
Mr. President, if I may answer the question about the objectives for the next 20 months. And I'd like to talk about infrastructure, about investment rates, social goals, and education. Needless to say, a fundamental requirement for us is security, and I've already talked about that in abundance. The matter of investment rates. We have attached great importance, I want to assign even greater importance to a sustained, solid, increasing rate of investment rather than sudden peaks and changes. In the recent years, we've gone from investment rates of 12, 14, 19, 22, 25. Last year, we reached 28, one of the highest investment rates. We've got a sustained process of building confidence, and the participation of the private sector was 22. That's a very good participation on the part of the private sector. International investments, which in Colombia was 1,002 billion, mainly in hydrocarbons, has reached levels of 10 billion, 6.5 last year, 29.8. Mining, 25%. And the rest of it are investments that are quite spread out, fortunately, in a large number of sectors. And sustaining that investment rate as an expression of confidence in Colombia is what will help us solve social problems. Those investments have to be made with a sense of social responsibility. And we've been defining social responsibility in 3 areas. First, transparency in the relationships between investors and the state, transparency in the allocation of contracts, settlement of disputes, transparency in taxation that President Arias has also referred to. Number 2, great responsibility with regard to the community beyond the law. There has to be solidarity on the part of investments in sensitive areas such as the environment. Colombia has 150 million square kilometers. It has 580,000 kilometers of jungle. 460,000 square kilometers are in the Amazon region. So we have a tremendous environmental responsibility. Our great enemy has been terrorism that has destroyed the jungle to plant drugs. We have a great potential, and we're beginning to produce biofuels. We already produced 1.2 liters per day of ethanol and sugarcane ethanol. This year we'll produce biodiesel with African palm oil. It's a commitment we have without destroying a single square millimeter of jungle space, without affecting a single square millimeter of farming land. We have 48 million square miles of farmland, a large number of cattle, and savannas where we can still grow in the production of biofuels and food security. That expression of social responsibility on the part of the investor in fields as the environment is important. And 3, labor harmony. We've gone from savage capitalism and class hatred. That was very painful and damaging. We need to go for labor harmony. And we also have a tremendous amount of difficulties in the field of the infrastructure. When President Calderon talks about the great effort that will make it possible for them to invest 5% of GDP in infrastructure, that's great. We're beginning a number of important projects to catch up, but we don't see the possibility of reaching that level of investment over GDP for the infrastructure. We're moving in that direction. I want you all to look at our new infrastructure projects. It's work that we need. It's important work. And then we have the hemisphere-wide infrastructure. This morning, President Calderon invited us to a breakfast, and we looked at the Panama-Puebla plan infrastructure needs. We looked at the region as a whole. We have to integrate the region when it comes to energy. There are important lines from Mexico to the south, and hopefully by 2010 we will have the interconnection between Colombia and Panama, and in that way we'll have an interconnection going all the way from Mexico to Patagonia, and we have to make similar efforts with gas. We're also very worried about highways. I think it's very difficult to talk about regional integration when the Darien gap continues to be closed. From the terminal in Colombia to Palo de Letra, where the Panamanian borders, there's only a 60-mile distance. I would like Panamanian public opinion to think and support the building of that road. If we delay this project, by the time we finish it, we will not be able to find the environmental treasure. It's easier now to build roads and protect the environment so that we can have those who protect the environment, because without those protectors, it becomes very difficult to protect the environment. And then, of course, there are the social goals. and I will refer only to education. We hope to consolidate in the next 20 months the goal of full coverage in basic information. We're up to 78%, university education coverage of 34%, we're at 22%. We have an institute for vocational training that's been modified, reformed, and it's training 5 million Colombians every year in technical areas. We're starting a program of teleeducation through the internet. We have changed and have made great progress in financing university education. We are going to be adding resources for research projects. And we believe that education is what produces the least political results in the short term, but ultimately that which provides the greatest competitiveness and equity in the longer term. An education project has to open doors, has to open the ways of social mobility and make our democracies more legitimate. So those are our main concerns for the next 20 months. Professor Hausman, without giving up security. For us, that is a very fundamental element. We're running out of time. Actually, we've run out of time. But I will give 1 minute to President Arias and 1 minute to President Calderon to wrap this up. President Arias. To wrap up everything? Yes.
Words.
I would like to ask your support for these 3 initiatives, which are going to be very good for mankind. A treaty on the arms trade so as not to sell arms to those who violate human rights, who systematically violate international law, and this is going to allow us to build a better world. In addition, there's no reason when the real enemies of humanity are poverty, disease, inequality, drugs, terrorism. It doesn't make sense for us to be spending in arms, because terrorism isn't going to be defeated with nuclear submarines or sophisticated weapons. Peace for nature, I already explained what it's all about. And the Costa Rica consensus, because I feel that it's very unfair that the international organizations, that the Paris Club, that the Group of 8, for the middle-income countries where there's still a great deal of poverty, because we haven't been able to build more egalitarian societies, are being punished like Costa Rica is, because our scarce resources have been devoted to teaching our people, to improving their health. Our health system spends 9% of our GDP, and that is only possible because we haven't bought a single tank or helicopter, and we don't have to pay for soldiers. And finally, peace with nature means something very simple. Let's bet on life. Let's choose life. A fair life, a free life, a dignified life, and a possible life. Thank you.
Although it's quite obvious, I think we've got to repeat what we want for our people. What we want is sustainable human development. It's an integrated concept, and it includes growth, it includes equity and growth, equal opportunities, harmony with the environment, security, etc. To place this in some order, what does Latin America have to do to be what it's called to be, not only a power in the new global context, but a reality in that context? In summary, I would use a word, and that is investment. First, investment in people, what people call human capital, I call it human value. investments in education, in our citizens, in our young people, in our youth. Investment in health. We have to have clear goals to avoid the very high child maternity rates that we have in our death in our countries. We can get into universal coverage. Given our increases in health coverage in the last 3 years in Mexico, we, by 2011, will have total health coverage. All Mexican men and women will have access to doctors, medication, hospital treatment, and medical care. Secondly, investment in physical capital. We need infrastructure so that our countries will become highly competitive. In our case, we know of our comparative advantages for Mexico to be a multi-directional link in this globalized world. Mexico is not the only country, is the only country that has borders with the U.S., but we also have 11,000 kilometers of coastline, half on the Atlantic, half on the Pacific, and that ties us with the most relevant markets in the world, Europe and Asia, and we're also proudly Latin American. That advantage we want to turn into a reality, turning Mexico into a logistic world trade platform through investments in physical capital, in infrastructure, both public and private, national and global. Thirdly, investments in natural capital. We cannot have sustainable human development unless it's harmonious with the environment. In Mexico, for the first time last year, we've been doing estimates, but for the first time in many years, maybe in decades, we recovered more areas of forestry than what we lost because of fires, hurricanes, or agricultural practices. On average, we lose 350,000 hectares, and we recovered through a number of reforestation projects almost 500,000 hectares. Last year we planted over 250 million trees in Mexico, and we're working very hardly for greater harmony with the environment. And finally, to generate investments and growth, we need economic investments, and for that we need what President Uribe has said, and which I simplify by using the word certainty, legal certainty, so that those who invest in Latin America shouldn't be afraid to lose of what they invest or the profits they make. Physical certainty, public security. We have to invest in public security, law enforcement, and institutions that will safeguard that security. Those are my ideas. Latin America has everything to win the game, but there is a prior requirement, and that is we've got to get rid of our complexes, our fears, our resignation that is secular. We think that everybody else is the enemy. They've hurt us a lot, and everybody else is guilty of our problems. It's time that we should have more confidence in ourselves. We have to be sure of what we are, what we want. Stop whining and accusing others, finger pointing, and get down to work. That's the road. Sustainable growth, investment in people, physical capital, and natural capital.
Quisiera pedirle ahora.
I'd like to ask Mr. Luis de Souza, Vice Governor of the State of Rio de Janeiro, to make an announcement. Good evening. First of all, on behalf of the Vice Governor Pezão, I would like to say how much we appreciate these beautiful days we've spent in Mexico, enjoying the beauty of this place and the very special warmth of these people. It's a great joy for us who come from Brazil and from Rio de Janeiro to have had this welcome and this wonderful seminar.
The World Economic Forum for this opportunity of these discussions. Governor Cabral from Rio de Janeiro is very excited with the prospect of hosting the next World Economic Forum, because we believe that this forum is really a venue for the exchange of ideas, to promote the integration of the region, has been discussed now, is strengthening the economic links, and really addressing tough questions, especially in the social areas. All of this is crucial for the growth of Rio de Janeiro, of Brazil, and of our regions. And the World Economic Forum is really a wonderful and unique venue to achieve these. Rio is really going through a very special time. We are receiving a lot of investment. In the oil area, we have investment of about $12 billion a year. We also have huge investment in steel mills, and especially in infrastructure, more mass transit, more services for the population. You have a huge task ahead of us, but I think you have made progress, and you'll be very happy to show and discuss this next year when we'll have the World Economic Forum there. So our private sector represented here by Mr. Raul Sanson from the Industry Federation of Rio de Janeiro, as well as the federal government represented here by Mr. Luis Barbosa from the Central Bank. They are also partners in this endeavor. Rio de Janeiro is a place of coming together, of cooperation of different levels of government, and we'll be really working, Mr. Schwab, to make a wonderful meeting there. We have to keep up with this wonderful meeting we're having here, and we are going to enjoy the support of Petrobras, of Vale, of BNDES, these household names in the whole regions that are their headquarters are in Rio, and you'll be very happy to have all you there. So, in the name of Governor Cabral, gostaria de, como disse o governador Pezão, vice-governador Pezão, receber a todos de braços abertos como Cristo Redentor nessa ocasião especial de o World Economic Forum no Rio de Janeiro 2009. Muito obrigado.
I would like to invite now Mr. Klaus Schwab, the Executive Chairman and Founder of the World Economic Forum, to close the meeting.
Well, first I would like to express our sincere thanks, and we are very grateful to you, President Felipe Calderón, in many ways for your engaged participation, for your patronage of this meeting, and I should add for the wonderful evening yesterday which we had the honor to join you. And I would like to include into our thanks the government of Mexico, all governments represented here. I also would like to include particularly Pro-Mexico, with its CEO, Bruno Ferrari, who have done such an extraordinary job 2 days ago to switch the venue at the last moment into the plenary hall. Special thanks to the government of Quintana Roo, and I would say to all the people of Mexico. It was great hospitality, warm hospitality, and I would like to include here the security forces who provided us with the necessary protection here, but I think it wouldn't have been even necessary. We are grateful to the co-chairs who did a very good job, and a special thanks goes to all my colleagues in the World Economic Forum under the leadership of Børge Brende, our Managing Director for Regional Activities, Governments and Stakeholders, and Emilio Lozoya, our Director for Latin America, who had the direct responsibility for this meeting. And I would like to ask all my colleagues from the World Economic Forum and from the staff in general who are here in the room to raise their hand or to stand up, just so we can recognize you. And a special thanks to our members and constituents sitting here in the room. I'm always proud because the World Economic Forum is not just a conference or an event. It's a community, and it's probably corresponding to the needs of the 21st century. It's a multi-stakeholder community integrating governments, business, civil society, academia, social entrepreneurs, all concerned about the state of the world, but also committed to do something to make this world a better place, and here to make particularly this region a better place. It would be too ambitious to try to draw some conclusions. So I just want, at the end of this meeting, to share some of my own impressions. First, I had the feeling to participate at a meeting which is at a turning point for the region, a positive turning point, because I felt the new self-confidence of the region. We all know that this self-confidence will be tested by the economic developments, by the financial crisis which we have seen unfolding, and we should be impressed by the optimism, the cautious optimism, despite those difficulties, despite our oil price today of $115 per barrel, despite a dollar and a euro exchange rate of 160 today, new records. But there was a cautious optimism which shows the resilience which has been achieved in Latin American economic, political, and social development. I also was impressed by, we talked about Latin America, we talked about the world, we talked about different countries. I think the future in a globalized world belongs to those who can blend a national identity with a regional identity and a global identity, and can at the same time manage all those three identities. And I think we have seen many demonstrations of this new harmony, which in the past, if I go back to my experiences, there were always clashes between those different levels of identity. One other striking conclusion for me is the reconciliation which we have seen between government and business. It's not anymore economy versus society. We have heard from you, President Calderon, and from you, President Uribe, today. It's not anymore left versus right. It's, as you expressed it yesterday, it's forwards or backwards. And let's not forget, we are living in a world where documented knowledge is doubling every 4 to 5 years. So the crucial challenge for all of us is how we manage change. And those companies and those countries will do well, who can turn this change into opportunities. And I think, again, here, what we heard makes us very optimistic. We also heard about the outward, and we have seen the outward orientation. It's not anymore, as it was in the past, just looking north. It's looking also south-south, the regional, the vertical integration of Latin America, but it's looking particularly to the east, to the new opportunities in the Pacific area. And I, as a European, of course, I would recommend to look also we looked Pacific is west, and we look to Europe. We should look to Europe, to east. And if I regret one thing, is that Europe was not more present in our discussions here, and we should do better next year in Rio, where I look forward to great hospitality. Now, the very decisive element to create a future which is better than the past, which is peaceful, is based on leadership. I think leadership is the crucial factor. We have seen many examples here of good leadership in business, social entrepreneurship, but this meeting closes with a panel of 3 people who have shown extraordinary leadership. I'm thinking of you, President Uribe, your steadfast stand against terrorism. At the same time, despite all those problems, which are not Colombian problems, they are not Latin American problems, they are world problems. If we don't solve those issues, our children will not enjoy a good life. So, our gratitude goes to you. President Oscar Arias Sanchez, your leadership in creating peace, peace without arms, peace among neighbors, for which you got the Nobel Prize, peace with nature, and last not least, President Calderon, your leadership in trying to catapult this country into the future, into the needs of a future world, and at the same time, if I may say so, confronting the legacies of the past. President Calderon, I think it's appropriate if you close now officially our meeting. Thank you.
For your words. Thank you, everybody, for attending this meeting in Cancún. Estimados presidentes,
Dear
Álvaro Uribe de Colombia,
Uribe of Colombia, Oscar Arias of Costa Rica, Álvaro Colón of Guatemala, who's also with us in the room, President Saca of El Salvador, who also attended this great meeting, and to all of you, thank you very much. I once met Klaus Schwab many years ago when I attended the World Economic Forum in Davos back in 1996 within the group of Global Leaders for Tomorrow, and I've always admired his words and his persistence in organizing and chairing the forum. I know about his great skills, his great love for humanity, his great wish for change, and that leads me to a very basic conclusion. If anybody has that leadership, has that ability of leading change, that ability of awakening appetite for change, that vision to analyze the problems of humanity, and even to anticipate itself to it. If someone has that leadership that the world needs today, it is precisely Dr. Klaus Schwab, to whom I'm extremely grateful for having thought of Mexico to organize this meeting of the World Economic Forum. And I think that it's been an extraordinary forum that ends today with great success. The discussions, the round tables, the attendants, who are top-notch, some of the most qualified business people from the region, from Mexico and from Latin America. 44 countries have attended this World Economic Forum in Cancun, so it's really been a true success. There's maybe something that worries me, and it's something that might worry others, and that is that on this occasion, and maybe for the first time in many years, in meetings of the Davos World Economic Forum, there were no demonstrations. There were no anti-globalization, so something's wrong with the forum, and we need to look into that. I also congratulate all of those who involved in the organization of the meeting, the participants, and Mexico thanks all of you for your visit here. I'm sure that what we've learned here today will be very useful for our lives and for our people. The topics that have been discussed, regional integration, the development of infrastructure, the spread of markets such as India and China, energy security, are fundamental topics for the future. In the World Economic Forum, and especially in the case of Klaus Schwab, I always see a vision that looks at challenges ahead of time. If somebody discussed the technological revolution before anybody else, it happened to be the WEF. If anybody took up the matter of the environment, it was also done here within the forum. If somebody discussed the problem with debts at the very beginning, it also happened to be the forum. I know that Professor Klaus Schwab said to Chancellor Angela Merkel before the meeting of the G8 that if anything needed to be discussed at this meeting, it was the matter of the food and price crisis that was coming upon us. Today, months later, that crisis faces us and is placing great pressure on our countries and our people. There's nothing better for human beings, for the rational animal, than to think and discuss ideas. Today, we have discussed and exchanged ideas, and that has enriched us all. In Latin America, we face a very special situation, namely the performance of the U.S. economy and its impact on the international economy. It's clear to me that that impact is closely related to the economies of ours. We're very dependent on the United States, as is Mexico and other countries, but Mexico more so than any economy in the region. In South America, in Central America, in Panama and Costa Rica and other countries, we're seeing economic growth rates that are very interesting. The key, if there is or isn't stagnation in the U.S., my dear friends, is to decide what do we do to speed up economic growth with justice. In other words, what do we do to achieve comprehensive economic development for our people, and how do we get Latin America to recover in the near term its ability to grow with harmony and with fairness? Those are the questions we need to take with us. What should we do as a region to place Latin America once again in the sight of the world investors? What should we do so that our region once again becomes a vigorous source of growth and investment. I've expressed a number of my ideas, and I'm going to repeat them. I learned from President Uribe something very valuable yesterday. He told me, you have to repeat ideas over and over and over. And when you get bored because you've said it so often, that's when people start listening. So I'm going to repeat some of the things I've said. One first aspect we need to watch over is conditions and the perception of certainty in Latin America. Latin America should not scare off investors, neither because of its government's practices or social situation. That means that the governments must take on clear commitments with legality based on a state of law with respect for patrimonial rights. The idea is that who invest in Latin America should know that at any time they can freely enjoy their investments and the proceeds of their investments without there being acts of the state that would endanger their assets. Secondly, in order to create certainty, we need to strengthen public security in our countries. Latin America has a special complexity. It's the point of origin and transit towards the largest drug market of the world, namely the United States. That adds tremendous difficulty to the task of people and governments. It turns the struggle against crime something that is much more challenging. At the end of the day, we must understand that Latin American people face criminal networks that are multinational, and that we can defeat them if we bring together political will, combine resources, and the necessary coordination among ourselves to engage in this battle. We must also say that at this stage, the United States also needs much to do and much to contribute to solve a problem which, after all, is caused mainly by its consumers. Thirdly, we must persist in defending the principles that will guarantee the development of societies, including respect for freedom, personal rights, human rights, and respect for democracy and to democratic institutional life. And that's why it's important to be alert and to avoid and oppose backward sliding. Dealing with public problems requires dialogue, the discussion of different views, and democratic resolutions that happen at the end of those debates. That's what democracy is all about, that those who have different views, have different interests, can solve our differences by using reason within the framework of our institutions. Only those who are opposed to the dialogue are those who are afraid of ideas. The dialogue can only be stopped by those who are frightened of truth. Let's open up the dialogue. Let's open up the doors to ideas and to reasoning. Democracy, as written by our dear Octavio Paz, requires that each one of us be able to live with his neighbor, that the minority accepts the will of the majority, that the majority accepts the minority or respects the minority, and that all preserve individual rights. Today, the people of Latin America have a chance to truly improve the way our people live. And for that, it's important for us to move ahead in strengthening our institutions and to guarantee everybody's rights. Latin America must also carry out reforms that will speed up competitiveness of our economies in the face of other regions of the world. We must not be afraid. In a global world, we must compete, and compete without fear that we have when we work with other regions of the world, against the old protectionism of people who think that economies are closing in, old protectionism that exists both in developing countries and in developed countries. We have much to gain if we change our economies and turn them into truly competitive economies. Fifthly, our countries must close the poverty gap. It is possible to achieve universal health coverage. It is possible to improve nutrition. It is possible to increase and improve the quality and coverage of education in our countries. For that, you need resources, but we must also implement public policies that have shown to be effective. Dear friends, participants at the World Economic Forum in Cancun, Mexico shares your values and its values with the countries of Latin America. And that's why we have to have a common agenda for progress and development in the region. The public, private, and social sectors must find synergies that will help us solve our problems. The idea is that together we can do more. Together we can turn our region into a powerful economic bloc. We can generate more well-being for our people. Together we can reduce poverty. Together we can avoid a deterioration of the environment and ensure a better future for future generations. This forum has given us a chance to get closer to one another. It's given us an opportunity to understand one another, to see how much we share and how it is possible to overcome our differences. I'm convinced that the conclusions arising from this meeting will be relevant for all. In companies, to take better decisions. In governments, to correct errors, avoid errors, and to govern better every day. This meeting will help all of us have a much better Latin America. Together we must work in building that Latin America that looks at the future with optimism and determination, willing to compete and to triumph in the 21st century. Congratulations to all of you for the success of this meeting, of the World Economic Forum, and its regional Latin American meeting. I'm convinced that the success of the World Economic Forum of Davos in all of its groupings and meetings is the success of ideas. And as long as in mankind ideas win over, mankind has to have hope. Congratulations, and have good trips back home. Thank you very much.
La declaratoria, aquí está.
Dile.